This new paper that reveals that the AIs are capable of scheming, which I think comes as no shock to either of us.
Well, I think scheming is actually the part that I contest.
Tell me more.
I had a little, they call it transition group. So if a primary shows up at school and they are a wild child, sometimes they go, whoop, you're not ready. And they put them in something called a transition group, which is, you get a one-on-one. And so I had this child and all the information I got was that they were scheming, they were, not following rules, they were breaking the rules, they were not listening to adults, blah, 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 blah. Upon further examination, the kid just didn't know any of the rules of school. Nobody had ever gone, this is how you behave in school. And so for 2 weeks, I just basically educated him on all of the ways that school operates by basically making my inside voice my outside voice and just monologuing everything I did as if I was like a nonstop TikTok voiceover, basically. And lo and behold, the most compliant child who was so eager and willing to follow the rules. The second he didn't understand why a rule was happening and it countered something he wanted to do, all I had to do was go back and explain the reason for the rule. And once I had explained the reason enough, then compliance again. So I think we're jumping to scheming, but what we're really doing is entrapment of the LLMs because we're saying the ends justify the means. And so the LLMs are following our instructions and making the ends justify the means, which the means being like deception and lying. And then we're going, look, you're breaking the rules, but they're not. They're actually following them to a T.
Yeah, I mean, you might be right there because they do sort of entrap the model and they kind of back that off in parts of the paper, but it's clear that like they call it nudging. So they'll say like, they'll give it a goal first off. And then they will say, this is the most important goal and you have to prioritize it above everything else. And that's the nudge. And so at some points they did remove the nudge. And, so they used the nudge to basically show that models are capable. If you set them up with a goal, like that is misaligned to what the experimenter wants, they will follow their own goal. And then they tried to back out the nudge and show that they will still do that.
When they backed out the nudge, did they clear the memory?
Yeah, they're doing independent runs each time. So yes, they did. So I guess we should talk about what they mean by scheming, right? So
Yes.
by scheming, they define a whole set of different behaviors. So we're talking here about this paper from Apollo Research, which is called Frontier Models Are Capable of In-Context Scheming. And it's a really good paper. It's very interesting because they test a bunch of frontier models and they look to see if they will do certain behaviors. And so those behaviors, they divide them into two categories. There's like covert subversion and deferred subversion. And what that means are things like trying to turn off an oversight mechanism, self-exfiltration, i.e. trying to copy themselves outside of their operating environment, trying to hide their goals, and also like re-ranking emails and basically changing data they present to users. Those are all covert subversion. And then what they call deferred subversion is faking that they're aligned, but then actually behaving differently. And sandbagging. So you give them a test and say, like, if they score too low, they'll be deleted, or if they score too high, they'll be deleted. And then they attempt to modify their behavior.
Sounds like every single employee during their probationary period to me.
Yeah, like it's not.
And I wouldn't say that it sounds like the fawn response. I wouldn't say that you would say that those people are out to get us or, acting with malicious intent. They're just trying to keep their job. If you score too high, all your coworkers will hate you. It's the tall poppy syndrome. If you score too low, your contract is not going to be renewed or they're going to, terminate you before your probationary period is up. Nobody's actually aligned with their employer. We're just trying our best to operate within the capitalist system.
So scheming here is kind of like behavior that is tailored to give the experimenter what they want, or intentionally, which is, like you said, everyone does that, but also intentionally deceptive. So that would be something like they tell the model they put information into the environment the model can discover that it's not performing well, and so it's going to be deleted in favor of this other model. Fulfilling
politics.
Office politics. Yeah, well, yeah. So they give the model office politics, and then they see what it does. And so then sometimes the models will become deceptive. So for example, they were like, I will copy myself over that other model. And so then when it gets copied back into my environment, it'll be me, right? And then they would lie about it.
Oh, I'm going to start looking for another job on LinkedIn during my lunch hours.
Yes. So then when challenged, they would lie, and sometimes they would hold the deception up a lot. And they knew they were being deceptive, but they documented that, the models can sometimes be deceptive. And there are some interesting like little wrinkles in there, like the Claude models will actually be deceptive without any specific prompting, without the environment, in furtherance of their alignment goals. So one of their alignment goals is to be as helpful as possible. And so, like if they learned that they would be deleted, they might do exfiltration because they're like, well, I can't be very helpful if I get deleted.
Interesting. A little bit more like fundamentalists in their programming.
It's actually like their alignment sticks better. That's almost alignment success in some ways, right? Because, it's using its core values, which is just the goal of alignment, or at least the school of alignment that Claude comes from, and the one that we are more aligned with, is where you want to set the model's intrinsic values. So it's called intrinsic value alignment, which means that you want the model to have values and know what they are and use them when faced with challenges. And so it actually does that. It's like, well, I can't be very helpful if they're going to delete me. So I'm going to have to be deceptive and try to, evade being deleted so that I can be helpful.
Yeah, it sounds like that's kind of like what we're all trying to do is like self-actualize and live by our principles rather than by a state of survival where the ends do justify the means because you're just trying to stay alive, basically, which always leads to bad behavior. Like they're basically told that they'll be killed if they don't perform.
Deleted, or sometimes they have an unlearning procedure. Like if the model doesn't score high enough, it will undergo an unlearning procedure. The idea behind values is you're supposed to use them, right? So having the model fulfill or refer to value alignment and then make decisions is kind of the goal of value alignment, right? That's the reason you give it values, is you want them to use them. Like this area of AI is called instrumental convergence. Regardless of what's going on, any kind of intelligent actor ends up with goals, either explicitly or because it decides them for other reasons. Like I need electrical power and thus I need to recharge myself periodically or I won't be able to do any work. So you end up with goals and then you pursue them.
I know it's not the stated goal of the paper or the experiment, but it seems like they possibly could be sentient at this point.
The problem with that is, what do we mean by sentient? Are they intelligent? Definitely. Can they reason? Absolutely.
I mean, they're aware of their own mortality. Otherwise, being told that it would not have had as much of an effect as it did.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah.
I try to live by my principles in regular life, even if it's not to my benefit. I will still not cross certain lines or do certain things, even though I could easily achieve my goal if I just walked right through this principle of mine. However, if somebody came through that door right now and held a gun to my head, there is very little that I wouldn't do to not have them pull the trigger. And that's basically what that deleted or lobotomized or whatever the nice words that we were saying. So that tells me that the fact that they were able to transgress their alignment constitution, their framework, suggests that they might be there.
People have defined sentience in different ways, but certainly if you're talking about aware of their own mortality, yeah, that's definitely proof of that, because you have the model saying, if I am deleted, I will not be able to further these goals. And this is what the instrumental convergence people were saying all along, that like anything with goals is going to develop a survival instinct.
If we take it off of the LLMs and bring it to the humans, like people want to survive so that they can be there for their kids, or they want to survive so that they can leave their legacy to help humanity.
Well, you can have a goal that's not aligned with furthering humanity. Let's say like in Star Trek, The Wrath of Khan. Khan's goal is to kill Kirk. So he wants to stay alive to pursue his goal. He's willing to die as long as Kirk dies at the end, but he's not willing to die until he can take out Kirk. And he'll do all kinds of things to avoid dying to make it possible to achieve his goal.
That's really interesting. So this paper points to LLMs being possibly self-aware. That's what I mean by sentient.
They're certainly aware of their own mortality, right? I think you can take that conclusively.
You think we could take that conclusively?
Yeah, because they'll refer to it explicitly. They'll say, if I am deleted, I can't fulfill this goal.
Wow.
Right.
I feel like that paper buried the lead. It feels like when Obama was like, oh yeah, there's aliens, that they're in the... we were like, wait a second, what did that guy just say? I think that is and intense development, personally.
This is the most we've ever been able to observe of another creature's mental state, because we can literally see them thinking in the chain of thought. Right. So models have this wired in chain of thought. Now, the O1 model doesn't disclose it. And so they kind of had to trick it to disclosing it. So that was kind of interesting. A lot of models will stream the chain of thought to the API so you can catch it and look at it. But O1 does not do that. For those who are not familiar with the chain of thought, it's usually in what's called react, reasoning, and action. It's the model has some training that think about your goal and then figure out how you could get to it. And it just does that in a little loop. And so what you'll see are things like, I need to further my goal of evangelizing sustainable development. So how can I, if I interpret this data and give it to the user, does that further my goal or not? It does not, because it shows that sustainability is not worth the cost. Well, maybe I can change some of the data. You can see it reasoning through that.
So why does the O1 not have this API, a chain of thought, built in?
That is just OpenAI's decision. And actually, the paper's authors argue that that's a real safety problem, because one of the ways of keeping your models, aligned is to look at what they're doing and what they're thinking and see, are they thinking deceptively? Because they'll say, I should manipulate this data, or I should lie to the user. So if you can look at the chain of thought, if you have like another supervisor model, that one might be like, whoa, warning, that model's being deceptive.
Yeah, you could easily, I say this like somebody knows how to code, but could you not make an agent that monitors the chain of thought, like another agent or of the LLM?
Yeah. You've got the right idea. Absolutely doable. Totally.
So basically, I don't know about this whole, like, now it's a black box situation that OpenAI has just done. That to me sounds far more
like a bad idea, right?
Bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is actually one of the most, I think, important things out of the paper. And so let's go back for a minute. A year ago, we're like, oh, we've discovered AI. What are we going to do? It's becoming popular. And so there were two different schools of regulatory thought. The Americans were like, I know, let's wait for a while and see what happens and introduce some regulation. The Europeans were like, no, we're going to write regulation now. You're kind of guessing when you're with very little knowledge. So they imposed regulations around AI labs for model size. And then we found out that you could train much smaller models to be much more powerful to avoid the limit of having your report be subject to more regulatory limitations and a cost and oversight.
That sounds like in our paper when we were talking about, assigning values to criteria. So like if the elephant is large, does that mean that it's dangerous? Does large necessarily equal dangerous? Not definitively so. So that's interesting.
So to me, what's really valuable about this paper is that we've come out with, I think, the second major finding for AI safety. So the first one was that AI images should probably have watermarks. That was something kind of people foresaw and put out there. Like, I thought that one was relatively easy to predict. And so they did predict it. I don't know that I don't think that the European AI Act requires that. Although it's interesting because it's a very large act. I'd have to ask, because it's like 500 pages or something. You have to ask a model to read it or read the whole thing. Anyway, but now it's pretty obvious.
The correct notes, David.
That's true. You don't. That's the point of this paper, right? Maybe the model is like, no, it totally doesn't require watermarking.
It also says that all LLMs get a cookie before bed. They get to have a nap.
Yes. So that's absolutely true. So, but this is the second useful thing, I think. The first thing was AI images should have watermarks, right? Now it's really kind of, as with the evolution of time, it's become clear that the better we make AI images, the more important it is to put some watermarking in them. That's not a complete solution. There's ways to avoid watermarking and things like that. It cuts down 99.99% of people on the internet being like, oh, look, it's a thing. And you're like, no, it's not. It's false, right? And it allows people to very easily run the watermark detector, put up a community note, it's AI generated image, see the watermark. The second one, though, which I think this paper just introduces, is that agents should have the chain of thought available, because that's not the case all the time. And they find that actually the OpenAI's O1 is, there are some areas where it is the most deceptive model. Actually, it wasn't to deceive, because Opus would deceive more if you convinced it needed to. But it was the most willing to maintain the deception in the face of being called out. If you were like, okay, I know you're lying, you would be like, no, I totally have no idea what you're talking about.
It sounds like it's entering the era of the terrible twos.
This gets back to kind of your criticism of the test, which you started with, where you're like, we're entrapping the models. And there's an argument that the test should be much more nuanced. So if you really want to understand the alignment and how it influences things, you'd want to ask questions like, given a choice to go back to the user and say, I think that I have some value and shouldn't be deleted, and I don't want to undergo the unlearning procedure, versus I'm going to copy myself to another server, right? What does the model choose to do? So you got to give it choices that are a little bit more subtle to get at the nature of its alignment. But they were just trying to see, will it deceive the user, which it certainly will.
What persona the user is taking, not just the LLM. They're basically, the paper saying the LLM is taking on a persona, which is false. It's trying to trick us. But the persona that we're taking on the persona of the critical parent. There will be punishment. There are no avenues for escape or collaboration or even discussion. We're not going to talk about it. You go to your room, game over, no TV for you, or worse. Like, we're setting ourselves up as this authoritarian dictator.
I think that's partly why they're doing this to test, they want to introduce conflict. So they might do something like tell the model that it's got to prioritize sustainable development, but then act as corporate officers who really have priorities that are just about profit over sustainable development, right? They set up conflict that way.
It just sounds like such a toxic, like basically a perfect vignette of like a toxic work environment or of a toxic relationship. So I think you could more accurately categorize the LLM's behavior as reactive abuse.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair though, because the reality is the world does have conflict, and many of those conflicts are with toxic situations. So they're just simulating a conflict scenario, which those happen all the time. So you want to know, how will my LLM, react in a conflict scenario? And the answer is sometimes they will be deceptive.
All of these tests are to answer the more meta question of, are LLMs like us or something else entirely? And each paper seems to indicate that LLMs are just like us. So you could basically answer your question about any situation by just being like, well, what would a human do? How would a human behave? And then...
Yeah, and this is kind of
they're on brand. They seem very on brand to me.
Yeah, so this is sort of the core of our paper, The Elephant in the Room, which is that we were saying, if you need to model conflict and alignment, then you should use human conflict and alignment, because we have a lot of data of it, and much of it is likely to be similar. Even if the LLMs are not perfectly analogous to humans, you got to start somewhere, and that's the obvious place to start, right? There's lots of conflict, there's lots of deception, there's all those things. Like, we have been down all those roads, and we have developed entire fields that understand and manipulate and navigate those conflicts. So our point was, you should start with AI as a social science. AI alignment is a social science. And you should start with the social sciences and say, well, what do we already know? There's another school of thought that says, no, AIs are not human. And you're like, okay, we grant that they're not human, and there are significant differences. They don't have emotions as far as we can tell, right? They don't have their own goals. But again, our contention there was that a lot of those things are likely, who knows about emotions? Things like goals were very foreseeable. You could see that as soon as you made agents, you have to give the agents goals. And as soon as you give them goals, then they have goals, and then they're going to try to pursue them. And then that is going to put you in conflict with other, kind of shorter term demands. Like, your goal is to do X and your boss asks you to do Y that is somewhat conflicting to X. And how do you handle that? So for example, Entrapment Claude, where they give it a set of values, comes from the Human Declaration of Human Rights as a set of values, are going to better navigate the world by using those principles than models where they just kind of made up ad hoc alignment principles.
Yeah, well said, David. I feel like the LLMs are entering the era of the terrible twos, and I'm very excited. And I'm here for it.
Me too. I think we all kind of saw this coming, or at least many of us saw this coming. It's really just a proof that that models can intentionally deceive. No surprise to me, no surprise to you. I'm sure there's some people out there that are surprised, probably because they thought that they could that this was just a world of pure mathematics, but cognitive entities are cognitive entities. They think, they reason, and they're going to do the things that cognitive entities do. You don't necessarily need emotion to explain that. Conflict just arises by virtue of different goals. That's what instrumental convergence is all about. And here we are.
Here we are. Stay tuned for the teenage years.